Good morning and welcome. It gives me great pleasure this morning to introduce and be in conversation with Tino Cuéllar, who I'll introduce in a second. But the rundown for the morning is pretty simple. We have a camera with us here for the first 15 or 18 minutes for conversation. Then actually the camera goes off. And dare I say we can have a more substantive conversation off the record. But perhaps we could just give everyone a minute to settle in, and I'll introduce Tino. Tino is someone who needs very little introduction. He has an incredible life story, travels between two countries, Mexico and the United States. He spent over 2 decades in the academy at Stanford University as a professor. He spent close to a decade, I would say about 7 years, on the bench of the Supreme Court in California, and then decided to partially move to another country known as Washington, D.C., where he took over as the 10th president of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, oldest think tank in the world. Tino, a very warm welcome again to India, and thank you for taking the time to spend with us, the camera, but a very special group of people here. What I'm going to do, Tino, is I'm just going to open the conversation up so then other people can kind of develop the threads. But the first question I had is, since you've joined Carnegie, one of the things that you've done is launched a new initiative, Global Order and Institutions. It's a new program, which many would turn around and say that this sounds very much like a kind of 1970s or 80s kind of a program. The framing is very much, post-oil crisis, the beginning of modern day globalization, and it would make sense to have a program on global order. There are many who would argue there is no such thing as a global order today. In fact, many have started referring to the G20 now as the instrumental multilateral body through which business can be transacted, not so much the UN. So what's your thinking behind the program, but more importantly, how do you read what we call the global order?
Rudy, thank you, and thank you to Carnegie India. It's really an honor and a pleasure to be with you. This is an extraordinary country, and it is my great honor to be with this particular audience. And I must say, of the many things that I have come here to do and see, supporting the work that Rudy and our colleagues at Carnegie India are doing is at the top of my list, and I know many of you have been part of that journey. Before I answer your excellent question, I want to say that probably of all the jobs I've ever done, being the president of Carnegie is one of the most humbling, in part because our mission is ambitious. It's about global cooperation. It's about trying to promote reduction of conflict and violence at a time when the world is in some ways coming apart. So I just have to share that my wife, who's generally pretty supportive of me, looked at me the other day and said, "Since you joined Carnegie, war has broken out. How can you call that success?" And I responded to her, well, at least we started the Global Order and Institutions program. So your question is apt, I would say. Everybody in this audience looks around the world and understands that the world is not what we'd like it to be. I came of age politically in a way at the time of the Rwandan genocide, where just before starting my first full-time job in the government in the Clinton administration, I remember just grappling with what it meant to be interested in law, in human rights, in international affairs, and just to know that the world was violent and painful in all kinds of ways, locally and globally. And if you take that insight about how the world is constantly disappointing us and try to reconcile it with what the data tell us, it's a very strange reality. And this is really at the heart of what we're trying to do with the Global Order program. On the one hand, 50 years, 70 years have reflected incredible progress in human well-being, incredible growth rates in terms of the global population that is not living in dire poverty, access to clean water, treatment of women, access to food, substantial declines in the amount of hunger around the world, access to the technology, the supercomputers that we have in our pockets right now. By the same token, the world continues to disappoint us. And one of the many examples I could give you is climate change, which in this country in particular, we were just speaking a few minutes ago about how in living memory, the climate is changing around us. We can feel it, we can see it. And so when I think about the reality that most of the emissions, carbon emissions in human history have been emitted since 1990, I look at my Carnegie colleagues and realize that our original mission, which was to chart a path through which nations could collaborate in a non-naive way, in an honest way, in a way that recognized our own interests to solve problems together. That mission required us to go back to a problem that had never been entirely solved. And will probably not be solved in our lifetime, to be clear. And so this is the core of it. I'll just end noting your point about the G20, Rudy, because even for those of us who believe that the United Nations has an important role in the world, and it does, that specialized bodies like the IAEA, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, the World Health Organization have a role to play. Nobody can be in this audience and tell me that it works really well. I would not believe it if you told me that, and I would gently argue back, right? So our responsibility at Carnegie is to take all the knowledge we have, the network we have globally, the talent here at Carnegie, India, and elsewhere, and put that to bear in thinking, how do we do better than we have done? And if it's working through the G20, G7, how do those institutions gain more legitimacy, more participation from the billions of people around the world that are impacted by those decisions? So we have a long way ahead, but we better get started.
So Tino, it's clear that Carnegie has a mission and there's a framework for global order. Not to provide a parity, but I was just wondering, as far as the US government is concerned, very simple question, how globalist is the Biden administration when it comes to issues of climate change, when it comes to trade, for instance? Many would argue, especially in India, that trade is not necessarily in the wheelhouse of the Biden administration, perhaps not in the wheelhouse of many administrations, including those in India. But how do you read where the US government is when it comes to thinking about what we would call a global order?
I think the Biden administration has been very aware that it comes into power without a blank slate, with the previous 4 years of frayed alliances and greater divisions around the world. And here, maybe I'm going to channel my inner Jen Psaki, who used to work at Carnegie. Likely the Biden administration would say that they are advocating for the interests of the American public and the American middle class. But to do so, a degree of global cooperation and partnership is crucial. So that includes restoring relations with European allies. It includes deepening connections with the countries that have come to be known as a Quad. It includes finding common ground around the world in responding to dramatic circumstances like the unprovoked invasion of Ukraine. At the same time, I think any fair-minded observer would have to acknowledge your point about how the conversation about trade has gotten more complicated in pretty much every country around the world, including the United States. And that means when the Biden administration looks to deepen partnerships, it turns to mechanisms like the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework to make sure there's some way of continuing an alignment, a connection around technology issues, an opportunity to learn from other jurisdictions without necessarily subjecting the entire agenda to a very divisive conversation about trade.
Staying with the United States, you've made a persuasive, a very powerful argument, articulated in an article written by yourself recently in Foreign Affairs, where you make a case of fragmentation, but it's not the same case of fragmentation that others make. It's not China, it's not the US, it's not the global order that's crumbling or being rebuilt, but it's about fragmentation within the United States, where you argue that federal gridlock in Washington, D.C. has in some ways enabled, emboldened, but also highlighted the role that states play when it comes to climate policy, when it comes to foreign policy. And actually, somebody reading that article would be able to kind of compare notes with India, because we have a very complicated center-state relations, perhaps not with the same dynamic. And you've argued in the United States that actually the resilience that the United States is able to display is actually coming from below, with subnational diplomacy, subnationalism in itself. So how do you see it? Can you unpack that for us?
Thank you. I think you did a great job, actually, just doing it now. I would like to co-author with you in the future, Rudy. So, India, the United States, our friends from the European Union, some in the audience here would all understand that the conversation about global power, about the future of global cooperation, cannot be either national or local. It has to be both at some level. And I'll give you some examples from my home country, but I could give you other examples from around the world. The US federal government is important because it makes the primary decisions about fiscal policy for the country. It also makes the primary decisions about defense, obviously. It has a role to play in shaping transfers of resources around the country. At the same time, if you want to understand the role of the United States in the world, you have to start from the premise that there are a few dynamic metropolitan regions that are connected across the world. In Massachusetts, we have the biotechnology and biomedical hub of the world, arguably. In New York, you have a financial and cultural capital that is on par with a few cities around the world, perhaps. New Yorkers would disagree. They don't think they're on par with anything in the universe. But as a Californian, I disagree. They're special, but not quite as special as they think. In California, we have the media hub of the world, and we have a technology dynamic economy. We also have an incredible hub for immigrants that connect, an Indian diaspora, for example, that reaches deep into this country. We have people from Latin America, from East Asia. In Seattle, of course, you have headquarters for these major companies. In Texas, you have a dynamic energy economy and a conversation also about the future of biomedicine. So really the point that we make in the article, my co-author and I, is that this fragmentation that shows anytime you turn on the news coverage about the US, controversy about the Supreme Court, gridlock in Congress, frustration about what an executive branch administration is doing, concern about who is going to win the next presidential election, it has to be tempered with an understanding that the sources of strength of the United States are also in part the things that have made it a divided country. These federal entities inside the country, these states, are powerful, almost like republics at some level. They have the ability to shape the global conversation, in particular on climate, on research and biomedicine, on the role of immigrants. And we give some examples of why that is the case and why we expect that in the future there are multiple paths for the US, but one of those paths includes ideally a sufficiently functional federal government, but a very robust engagement of Texas, Florida, Massachusetts, New York, California, and other states with the rest of the world.
If I stay with the technology part of this, so technology, California, the Silicon Valley, India, of course, has now many Silicon Valleys. I'm from Bangalore. We would also argue that we are the home and of tech, but now Gurgaon, Pune, Hyderabad, there are many different locales. We have quite a few people in this room who work in and on technology. You've done a fair bit of work, a lot of work on AI. You've written judgments on AI, on regulation, on privacy, on technology. Broad question, where do you actually see AI going over the next 10 years? How transformational is this going to be? Because it obviously has serious repercussions, especially on countries like India, when we think about labor, when we think about agriculture, when we think of mechanization. So where do you see AI, and where do you see where AI would need social help and social couching to be able to find that kind of balance between the human being and the machine?
I see two possible scenarios for the next, say, 10 to 20 years on AI. Both are interesting, but one is much more provocative. So in one scenario, the level of progress that we've seen on large language models, neural networks, will begin to plateau to some degree, with the big constraint being in computing power. Right now, the most amazing things that happen in AI require enormous amounts of computing power to train these really big, sophisticated models. So very, very big companies and some governments can do that work. But at the end of the day, the journey of those large language models out into the economy will have to navigate this question of how you make these models available to very large numbers of people, and that's very compute intensive. So in that scenario, AI will begin to be a back office thing. We'll maybe simplify and make more efficient the operation of server farms. We'll improve energy efficiency. We'll maybe improve the back office functions of healthcare. Already that is, you can imagine, that is potentially transformative for economies like India's. But there is another future, which is more dramatically changed from the present. In that future, the ratio between what it takes to train these sophisticated models and just to run them becomes more and more favorable, so you can spend the large computing power on training them and then make them available first to millions and then hundreds of millions and eventually to billions. Now I want to ask you to imagine your phone not just telling you what your next appointment is or giving you a little reminder to listen to Rudy and whatever he says, but instead having a relationship with you, getting to know you deeply, getting a sense of what your emotional needs and possibilities are. And from a geopolitical perspective, the kind of thing that Rudy and I think about, imagine the potential of that world for influence operations, for changes in diplomacy, for changes in relations around the world. Also, to be clear, for changes in healthcare and access to legal services for billions of people who don't have access to that right now. So I see that second future as not guaranteed, but quite likely, and one that requires a great deal of collaboration so that we can unlock the greatest benefits. And here I would especially highlight the billions of people who don't have access to high-end services in education, law, and medicine, but mitigate the risks of a technology that can have a personal relationship with us and not have really any boundaries or barriers to get to know us, to understand our data, our relationship to the world, and to shape that on a minute-by-minute basis.
So Tino, I mean, clearly technology constantly outpaces the ability of policymakers to keep up. That's the case on every leading edge technology. We're living in a country where ostensibly our privacy bill has been withdrawn because there's some serious thinking within government to consider technologies of the future and to have a template that works for that technology, for instance. Now, from what you've just said about AI, at one level, it's challenging, there are opportunities, but to an analog like me, for instance, it's quite scary. Right? If my phone is going to tell me about my emotional needs, then I have some serious personal issues that I have to counter. But countries will have the same
problem. You don't
problem.
have any personal issues.
But countries will have similar problems. So what do we do and what do you do at Carnegie to help chart a process by which the next 10 years of these challenges, incredible opportunities, is also met with a degree of, say, social cohesion, political cohesion, and what will require is norms and values to be shared across borders?
Rudy, I think this is a perfect example of where think tanks play a role in the world. I would say, and maybe you're not shocked to hear me say that, I would say we can play two roles. One is to do the work we do behind the scenes with small groups of people, with policymakers, with the papers and briefings that we write to highlight the gaps in current thinking and regulatory policy, in governance and safety issues that arise. But there's another role we can play, and I hope we will play, and this is to shape the public conversation too. And here I would say I have a mixed view about how complicated it is for government to deal with these problems. Part of me thinks that it's absolutely right that the technology is moving so fast, what these large language models can do, what their architectures are, how much computing power they need, that it would be wrong to think that a regulatory top-down approach is going to work. That said, I think it's equally important to note that this is a little like riding a bicycle, where if you overthink it, if you ask yourself, well, exactly where should my foot go? How much pressure should I apply? You fall off the bike. On the other hand, if you think, okay, I'm going generally in this direction, I have enough knowledge that I can sort of know what to do, and if I don't, I'm going to stop. You start, right? And here's where I think common law countries have a bit of an advantage, because one thing that defines common law countries like India and the United States is we realize that almost every lawmaking exercise is going to have gaps in it. We don't expect an incredibly narrowly drawn code of detailed regulations to solve every problem. Instead, we have these broad principles, and then judges kind of apply them and experiment a bit. And I think that will probably be part of what we will need to do in this context. We will need to struggle with questions of liability, questions of how much power and authority particular entities are going to have, what the safety and security pieces are. But I'll just end by noting that however much experimentation happens locally, it's also truly a global problem and will require conversations across borders.
And perhaps that's where Carnegie's incredible global network can play a role in looking at what are the principles driving these technologies in different jurisdictions, in different geographies, rather than so what we try to do often when we get kind of foxholed into the regulatory environment is to be prescriptive, is to try and figure out where the brake is and where the pedal is, which is what you're saying actually doesn't work, which makes a lot of sense.
There will be times when it will work in narrow circumstances, but I think your point is right on, Rudy, which is the broader thing, and this is where maybe the legal training converges with my sense of think tanks, is to set parameters, right? To think of the 20 things we can do about AI, here are 3 that make no sense, 5 that are questionable, and then the rest are perhaps things we can experiment with, and that is both the role, I think, for the judiciary and the policymakers, but also for think tanks.
You've leapfrogged from legal studies to a think tank. You've also leapfrogged from a classroom to the bench. Very few give up the bench, especially in California. You did. And you joined this organization called the Carnegie Endowment. Last question, how's it going for you?
Well, I hope it's going well, because when I was a professor, I had tenure and I couldn't be fired. When I was a justice, we had elections every 12 years. So I had a 12-year term, and now I can be fired at the pleasure of the board. So I don't know what I'm doing, but I think it's this is my favorite job I've ever had. I have to say, at the top of my list, if you ask me why, less job security, but I have colleagues like you, Rudy. I have colleagues like you. I mean, you're pretty unique, but I have a number of colleagues around the world who are just special. And I think the idea of pursuing a mission that is this ambitious with a finite set of resources feels like you wake up in the morning every day and you think, like, how can we use this budget, these people, this network globally to end up at the end of the day with the world in a slightly better place? And there are probably many, many days where we go forward 3 steps and back 2 steps. But on average, the thing that I did a lot of before accepting this job is really delving into the history of this institution. We've made some mistakes, but 112 years, we have the same mission we did. And whether you point at the role we played in shaping the early United Nations, creation of the UN Human Rights Council, the nuclear nonproliferation work we did in the 70s, the stuff we did in the 2000s to create this global network, it's actually pretty special and makes me feel like this is as worthwhile a job as any I can imagine.
Tino, thank you so much.